Hello and welcome to part 2 of our series answering your questions on worship, following on from the teaching series that we recently did at Rev. These are your opportunity to send in your questions of anything outstanding. And this question is, when in the series we looked at tongues and interpretation and prophecy, spiritual gifts that Paul seems to particularly emphasize when we're gathered together to worship. And the question essentially is, why does Paul focus on those gifts in particular when we gather to worship? So let me read from chapter 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the chapter that we focused a lot on in our series, and verse 2, just as a reminder. He says, "For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God, for no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit." And verse 3, "On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation." And I think when you take both of the gifts, or all three of the gifts, you include interpretation, but tongues and interpretation together and then prophecy together, what we see Paul emphasizing, or what we see emerging, is really a dialogue between the people and then God to the people, and conversation emerging. And what Paul really is emphasizing here, I think, is relationship. All of us know that what is required for a good, healthy, ongoing relationship is communication and dialogue, and being able to speak and also being able to hear, and being able to express yourself, and being able to hear the other person express themselves. And that's exactly what we see with the gathered church and God through the gifts of tongues and interpretation. With tongues and interpretation, you have a sense of together we are communicating with God. So we're praying out in tongues, a gift where nobody understands in the natural sense, but it's clearly man communicating with God in a spiritual language. And you then get, immediately following on, the gift of interpretation, something that then everybody can say yes, and Paul even encourages to say amen to, a kind of, this is what we agree to, this is what we are saying to you, God, a kind of a prayer of worship or a prayer of thanksgiving towards God. And because two people are involved, you get this sense of we are doing it, of us communicating to God and worshipping and thanking him for who he is, what he's done. And then with prophecy, you get the sense of God very much speaking to the people. There's clearly an emphasis as you go through the chapter of prophecy being something that everybody gets to hear, and then collectively is what he says kind of weighed. Everybody evaluates together the message, and each one is trying to discern, is this for me or not? And you think, if God is interested in communicating individual messages to individual people, he could have just done that in a different way where not everybody hears. But regardless of the fact that it might be particularly for an individual or just a few people within the congregation, he wants it heard by everybody. So that there's this sense of everybody in the church being addressed by God through the prophetic gifting. And I think that what you see as these gifts are used in worship time is something of a kind of spiritual dynamic, spiritual conversation exercised by faith, choosing to use these gifts that are a bit odd, a bit kind of do require a bit of faith to step out and use. But through people faithfully stepping out in them, you get this sense of we are talking to God and God is talking to us. And I think that then, why does Paul emphasize God's role in it of the prophetic gifting particularly? We looked at this a bit in our teaching series, that he is addressing an overuse of tongues, and so that's why he seems so pro the gift of prophecy and seems a bit against the gift of tongues. It's a bit more balanced than that overall, but he does nonetheless seem to be saying, no, I really want you to go after prophecy. And that being a general thing for the churches, is that I think he knows that there's a real importance that we hear the voice of God, that we know that we are able to talk to God, that's maybe easier for us to believe. But for us to really believe in this relationship, for us to really believe God is here, God is with us, that he is interested in this relationship, he says, go for the prophetic gifting so that you have these manifestations of the Spirit, as Paul says through the chapter and back in chapter 12 as well, so that you will know God is also present in this relationship. It's easy for you to believe in your presence in the relationship. It's less easy for you to believe in God's presence in it and that he is active in it. So go after the prophetic so you you have evidence and you can be convinced God really is in this as well. So that's why I think tongues and interpretation and then prophecy, on the other hand, are so important to all be used, because it completes the conversational dynamic that we have in our worship time. So not every worship time needs both of them or all of them, but as a general thing, we should be pursuing tongues and interpretation and prophecy for our ongoing communion with God as a church family. Hope that's helpful.